Now that we've learned how average revenue and marginal revenue relate to each other when you have a downward sloping or negatively sloped demand curve, we're going to go ahead and look at the concept of profit maximization for a monopoly. Now, I don't know, a side note or a caveat here. Look, to be honest, as long as you have a negatively sloped demand curve, the way that you calculate profit maximization or establish profit maximization and where that occurs, it's really going to be the same, whether it be a monopoly, an oligopoly, or monopolistic competition. The only real difference is that we assume for a monopoly that PED is going to be rather inelastic. And the biggest reason for that is that there are zero substitutes for a monopoly. Remember, we said one of the characteristics of a monopoly is that they are the only provider of a given good or service. So, you might make the demand curve a little bit more steep if it's monopoly and make it a little bit more shallow if it's, say, monopolistic competition because there's so many substitutes. But that's really the only difference between the rest. So really you can retitle this, instead of monopoly profit maximization, it could just be profit maximization with a negatively sloped demand curve. That being said, I am going to, as I talk about things, I'm going to be thinking about a monopoly. So I'm going to try to say this in the way that would be more accurate to just a monopoly. Okay, so when we look at profit maximization, the same rule that we saw with perfect competition is going to hold. Profit maximization occurs at the quantity, remember we're talking about a quantity first, at the quantity where MC, marginal cost, is equal to MR. So here's MC and here's MR, and we see they intersect right here. So we're going to call this QPM. So that's the quantity at which profit maximization occurs. Any quantity to the left or right of that, the profit for this company is going to be smaller. And remember what we're saying here. In a marginal sense, these marginal costs are less than, if I go straight up above, so this is a quantity to the left of QPM. So for this quantity, the marginal costs are smaller than the marginal revenue, so by producing it, profit grows. And that remains true until they intersect. And at that point, once I go past there, if I produce one more, now the extra costs are greater than the extra revenue, so my profit has to shrink because the extra costs are greater than the extra revenue. So this is the point at which profit will be the largest. The next thing I do is from this point, so going straight up from here, really once we've figured this out, nothing to the left or right matters. All that matters is what the average cost is and the average revenue at that quantity. So that's why I always say up and over. So from this point, we're going to go label it QPM, then we're going to come up to average cost and over and up to average revenue. So now what we can see is at QPM, the average revenue is greater than the average cost. So that means that overall, this company is going to make not just profit, because remember that's a cost, but abnormal profit. We can show the amount of that abnormal profit as a revenue box or a box. Very simply, it's this box that is created between average revenue and average cost over to QPM. So this region of abnormal profit is saying that the average cost, so all of this entire tall rectangle is the average revenue up until here, but the cost is only this rectangle here. So because the total revenue, which is this box, is greater than the total cost, the smaller rectangle, then we have this abnormal profit. Now remember, we said in perfect competition, what will happen is that might exist in the short run, but in the long run, more and more firms would enter the industry, and that would reduce the abnormal profit until they got to a break-even profit position. But for a monopoly, that's not true. Remember, one of the characteristics of monopoly is that barriers to entry are very high. So high that no other firm can enter the market. Therefore, the way this is drawn up, this abnormal profit is available not only in the short run, but in the long run as well. Let's take a look at a couple of other examples though, because just because you're a monopoly, it doesn't mean that it has to be abnormal profit. So it's important to note that just because a company is a monopoly does not guarantee them abnormal profit. So I'm going to use as an example Pemex, not because they're making an abnormal profit or not, just it's a good example of a monopoly. Pemex is the state-owned petroleum company of Mexico, and it's the only provider of petroleum gasoline in Mexico. If you buy gas, if you fill up your tank, you do it at a Pemex. Okay, so let's say that inside of Mexico, and Mexico is a net exporter, meaning they export oil more than they import. They do import some, but they're a net exporter of oil. But let's say for some reason that their costs of producing oil begin to rise. Well, if that occurs, what we're going to see is that as those costs rise, we're going to see the intersection of MR and MC, which is shown here in yellow, is going to move along with that. That is, the MC curve slides up the marginal revenue curve, and we have an intersection here instead of some other place. So this is going to be our new quantity of profit maximization, and we see that that moved to the left. Well, what that means is that Pemex's profit situation has now changed. So we're still going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to go find average cost and average revenue. And this time what we notice is that this box, which represents total cost, is now smaller than this other rectangle below it that's total revenue. Well, if total costs are greater than total revenue, or if average costs are greater than average revenue, remember that's saying the same thing in a different way. Then instead of having abnormal profit, instead, now we're going to have what we call economic loss, shown by the shaded area in red. So just because they can control the price doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to make an abnormal profit. But remember, it's highly likely because it's so inelastic that it's just in most cases it's going to be possible. A third situation that can occur is that the point where MR equals MC QPM, at that point we're going to find average revenue and average cost being the exact same. So if this occurs, what we're going to have here is what we call a break-even profit. And I guess the whole point of this is that when we look at average revenue and marginal revenue, that's one system, and marginal cost and average cost is a different system. You compare them, but they don't have a specific relationship with each other. That is, they function independently of each other. So, like we already said, monopolies, in this case Pemex, they have to obey the law of demand, which is that they can control the price or the quantity, but not both. Therefore, they are not guaranteed abnormal profit, but because they're a monopoly, it's highly likely. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below.